Tehran, Iran. February 28, 2026. It was an ordinary morning in the Iranian capital when, at 9:30 a.m. local time, the first explosions shook the city center. Columns of black smoke rose over Jamhuri Square. In a matter of minutes, the entire world was watching. What happened that day was not just another attack by Israel against Iranian military targets. It was something that geopolitical analysts considered unlikely, risky, and potentially catastrophic: a decapitation strike against the very heart of the Iranian regime. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader for 36 years, the man who had guided the Islamic Republic since 1989, the architect of the so-called Axis of Resistance, was killed in a joint attack by Israel and the United States. This event did not come out of nowhere. It is the result of an escalation that lasted decades, accelerated dramatically after October 7, 2023, went through a 12-day war in June 2025, and reached an unprecedented inflection point in early 2026. To understand what is happening, and what might come next, we need to go back in time and analyze the pieces on this board carefully. But before we dive into the analysis, let me ask you 3 questions that will guide this entire video. First, was the assassination of Iran's supreme leader a strategic victory for Israel and the US, or a historic mistake that could drag the world into a dead-end war? Second, why were the nuclear negotiations abandoned just as they were progressing? Who, in fact, didn't want an agreement? Third, are we facing a new order in the Middle East, or the beginning of unprecedented regional chaos? This video will explain what really happened, show the historical context of decades, analyze the strategic interests of each actor involved, and explore possible scenarios for the coming years. If you want to truly understand the geopolitics of the Middle East, and not just the headlines, stay with us until the end. In the early hours of February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States launched what was called Operation Epic Fury, a series of coordinated and simultaneous airstrikes against multiple targets across Iranian territory. Of Iran's 31 provinces, 24 were hit. The main target was Khamenei's residential and work compound in Tehran. According to reports in the Israeli and American press, 30 bombs were dropped on the site, in addition to Blue Sparrow ballistic missiles. The attack took place in broad daylight, a deliberate choice to maximize the psychological impact and ensure visual confirmation of the destruction. On the morning of March 1, Iranian state media confirmed what the world already suspected: Khamenei had been killed. Along with him, his daughter, son-in-law, grandson and daughter-in-law Zahra Hadadadel died. Other senior regime officials were also killed in the initial attacks. American President Donald Trump got straight to the point in his statement on Truth Social. Then, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Iran represented an existential threat that needed to be eliminated, and that military action would create the conditions for the Iranian people to take their destiny into their own hands. Reported fact: according to Oman's foreign minister, who acted as mediator, the February 2026 attacks occurred at a time when nuclear negotiations between Iran and the US had achieved significant progress. Just as happened in June 2025, the bombs fell exactly when diplomacy seemed to advance. Analytical interpretation: this raises a central question that analysts debate intensely: were the negotiations genuine, or did they serve as a strategic instrument to position Iran at a moment of maximum vulnerability before the attack? Iran reached February 2026 extremely weakened by multiple simultaneous factors. Its nuclear program had been partially destroyed by the attacks of June 2025. Its regional allies, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, had been significantly weakened by Israeli military operations since 2023. In January 2026, the regime put down with extreme brutality the largest popular uprising since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, killing thousands of protesters in 48 hours. The Iranian economy was collapsing. The regime's internal legitimacy had reached its lowest point in decades. It was, in geopolitical language, a window of opportunity that Israel and the US decided to exploit. The Iranian regime, despite being decapitated, did not collapse. Within hours, Iran launched what it called a survivable response, waves of ballistic missiles and drones targeting Israel, American military bases in the region and Gulf countries that host U.S. forces. A 99-year-old Shiite cleric has issued a fatwa calling all Muslims to jihad against the U.S. and Israel. By March 5, 2026, Iran had fired more than 500 ballistic and naval missiles and nearly 2,000 drones since the start of the conflict. About 40% were directed at Israel and 60% at American targets in the region. Airports were closed, including Dubai, one of the busiest in the world. Gulf oil and gas production has been affected. The Strait of Hormuz, through which about 20% of the world's oil passes, has been threatened with closure. Reported fact: by mid-March 2026, more than 1,255 people had been killed in Iran, including 200 children. In Lebanon, 570 deaths were recorded. In Israel, 13 people died. 8 American soldiers were killed. In Minab, in southern Iran, an attack destroyed a girls' primary school, killing 165 people, most of them children under the age of 10. Analytical interpretation: the conflict quickly ceased to be a surgical operation and turned into a war of attrition with no clear diplomatic outcome. As Al Jazeera analyzed, the decision to move from attacks on nuclear infrastructure to a strike to decapitate the Iranian leadership destroyed previous rules of engagement and eliminated channels for negotiation. The international community reacted in a deeply divided manner. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned that diplomacy had been wasted. The European Union called Khamenei's death a decisive moment but called for de-escalation. The United Kingdom condemned the Iranian attacks but refused direct military participation. Russia and China condemned the American-Israeli strikes as violations of the UN Charter. North Korea called the operation illegal aggression. And Pakistan, with its large Shiite population, has seen violent demonstrations in Karachi and other cities. We are therefore facing something much bigger than a bilateral conflict. What began as a dispute over Iran's nuclear program has turned into a confrontation over the order of the Middle East, and over who will set the rules of the international game going forward. To understand the war of 2026, it is necessary to go back to 1979, the year in which everything changed. Before the Islamic Revolution, Iran was a close ally of Israel and the United States. Shah Reza Pahlavi maintained diplomatic relations with Tel Aviv and close cooperation with Washington. Ironically, Iran was one of the few Muslim countries that actually recognized Israel. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini came to power in February 1979, this balance was completely reversed. The Islamic Republic redefined its geopolitical identity around 2 pillars: opposition to the American Great Satan and destruction of Israel, called the Little Satan. The American embassy in Tehran was seized. 52 diplomats were held hostage for 444 days. The rupture was complete. In the following years, Iran patiently built what it called the Axis of Resistance, a network of armed groups and political allies spread across the Middle East with the explicit aim of encircling Israel and eroding American influence in the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, founded in 1982 with direct Iranian training and funding. Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine. The Houthis in Yemen. Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. Each piece on this board served a long-term strategy. For decades, this conflict has been fought in the shadows, through assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, malware attacks like Stuxnet that sabotaged uranium enrichment centrifuges, intelligence operations, and proxy wars. Israel and Iran have never faced each other directly, until 2024. At the center of it all is Iran's nuclear program, the issue that has most haunted international politics for 2 decades. In 2015, after years of negotiations, the world celebrated the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The deal limited Iranian uranium enrichment in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions. It was imperfect, but it worked. In 2018, Donald Trump, in his first term, unilaterally withdrew the US from the agreement, calling it the worst deal ever made. Iran responded by gradually abandoning its commitments. In 2023, the country had enough enriched uranium stock to manufacture at least 10 nuclear weapons, if it chose to militarize. The window to stop the Iranian bomb was closing. The Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, which killed approximately 1,200 Israelis and kidnapped more than 240, changed everything. Israel didn't just go to war in Gaza. He used the crisis as a strategic opportunity to dismantle the axis of resistance that had been built for decades. In 2024, Israel assassinated practically the entire Hezbollah leadership, including Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. Without its historic leader and with much of its infrastructure destroyed, Hezbollah has been drastically weakened. In Syria, the fall of Bashar al-Assad, facilitated in part by the elimination of Hezbollah protection, removed another pillar of the Iranian axis. The Houthis in Yemen remained active but isolated. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched a full-scale attack on Iran's nuclear and military facilities, the first direct confrontation between the two military powers in 45 years. For 12 days, Israel bombed Natanz, Fordow and Isfahan. Iran has fired back with missiles almost daily. 28 people were killed in Israel and hundreds in Iran. On June 21, the US entered the conflict, attacking the most heavily protected facilities in Iran's nuclear program, bunkers so deep that Israel could not destroy it alone. On June 23, Trump announced a ceasefire on social media. The agreement, mediated by Oman, came into force on June 24. This 12-day war revealed something crucial: Israel had demonstrated the ability to overcome Iranian air defenses with relative ease. Iran, on the other hand, had shown resilience and capacity for continued retaliation. Both sides learned lessons they would use 8 months later. In January 2026, Iran faced the largest popular uprising since the Islamic Revolution. Motivated by the economic collapse, destroyed infrastructure, and the brutality of the regime, millions of Iranians took to the streets. The regime responded by killing tens of thousands of protesters within 48 hours. That massacre, which Trump initially threatened to punish militarily before backing down, created the strategic window that Israel and the US had been waiting for. The regime was weakened externally by the attacks of 2025, internally by the revolts of 2026, economically suffocated by sanctions. It was time to act. The historical lesson that applies here is that of the shock doctrine: regimes under simultaneous pressure from multiple fronts are more vulnerable to decisive interventions. This logic was used in Iraq in 2003, in Libya in 2011, and was being applied to Iran in 2026, with results still unpredictable. Strategic objective: eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat permanently and, if possible, bring about a regime change in Tehran that replaces the hostile government with a more pragmatic or westernized leadership. Possible gains: with Khamenei dead and the nuclear program degraded, Israel would have eliminated what its leaders call the number one existential threat. Israeli Defense Minister Gideon Saar explicitly stated that a delay would allow Iran to achieve nuclear immunity, a point of no return that Tel Aviv was unwilling to accept. Additionally, Minister of Science and Technology Hila Gamliel indicated that new Israeli elections would be brought forward to June or July 2026, suggesting that the war also served domestic political purposes for Netanyahu. Risks involved: the decapitation strike can have the opposite effect to that desired. Khamenei's death at foreign hands triggers the so-called rallying around the flag effect, turning the dictator into a martyr and strengthening the regime's cohesion rather than dissolving it. As The Economist pointed out, the parallel with the Shia concept of martyrdom can, paradoxically, benefit the regime. Furthermore, without a clear exit strategy, Israel may have begun a protracted war of attrition without defined victory conditions. Strategic objective: eliminate Iran's nuclear program definitively, force regime change, and reaffirm American hegemony in the Middle East, all without a long-term ground commitment. Possible gains: Trump described the attacks as the Iranian people's best chance to take back their country. Geopolitically, the end of the Ayatollah's regime could reshape the entire architecture of the Middle East, pave the way for agreements between Iran and Gulf states, reduce funding for groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis, and eliminate decades of anti-American hostility. Strategically, long-range airstrikes, the American specialty, allow force projection without the political cost of sending troops into ground combat. Risks involved. The Brookings Institution points out that the Iranian regime, unlike Gaddafi in Libya or Assad in Syria, is not structured around a single man. It is a complex institutional system with multiple centers of power. Experts warn that the use of ground forces may be necessary to achieve the stated goals of regime change, something Trump has promised to avoid. The destruction of the school in Minab, with Tomahawk missile debris identified at the site, created a public relations crisis and accusations of war crimes. Strategic objective: survive the conflict, impose maximum costs on the aggressors, and preserve the Islamic regime, even if in a modified form. Possible gains: Iran has adopted what analysts call the madman strategy, unpredictable, high-impact attacks on regional targets to demonstrate that it is not a paper tiger and that any aggression will have global costs. The threatened closure of the Strait of Hormuz and attacks on Gulf countries have created international economic pressure for de-escalation. Internally, the narrative of Khamenei's martyrdom could consolidate the support of the regime's bases and hinder a transition of power. Risks involved: with conventional military capabilities severely degraded, Iran faces the risk of a protracted war of attrition that could destroy its civilian infrastructure, intensify the population's economic suffering, and eventually provoke the territorial fragmentation that Washington and Tel Aviv appear to aspire to. The Kurds in western Iran are already organizing themselves militarily with American-Israeli support. Putin's Russia condemned the operation as a cynical violation of all norms of human morality and international law. But analysts like those at Brookings note that Putin may discover new incentives for compromise in Ukraine peace talks, fearing that American impunity in Iran will normalize decapitation attacks against state leaders, including himself. China, which had invested heavily in economic relations with Iran, saw its main regional partner come under attack. Beijing condemned the attacks and signaled diplomatic support for Tehran, but avoided military commitments, calculating its long-term interests in a post-conflict Middle East. Europe was left in an awkward position, condemning the American-Israeli strikes as violations of international law, but simultaneously expressing satisfaction with the weakening of Iran's nuclear program. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has explicitly said he does not believe in regime change from the skies, an indirect but clear criticism of Washington and Tel Aviv's strategy. Based on historical patterns and analyses from leading geopolitical research institutions, the most likely scenario for the coming years is a prolonged war of attrition, with no decisive victory for either side, what Al Jazeera called a dead-end diplomatic trap. In the short term, Khamenei's succession by his son Mojtaba, a relatively young and little-known cleric, creates a paradoxical dynamic. On the one hand, the choice of a family heir suggests ideological continuity and may weaken the new leader's religious legitimacy before the great clerics of Shi'ism. On the other, as the history of the Islamic Republic has demonstrated, the system was constructed precisely to survive the death of any individual leader. Foreign policy highlights a crucial historical lesson. When Iranian President Rajai and Prime Minister Behoner were assassinated in less than a month in 1981, the system found a new leader, Khamenei himself, in less than 50 days. When President Raisi died in a helicopter crash in 2024, the transition was smooth and quick. The Iranian regime was designed to outlast anyone. The most dangerous scenario in the medium term, between 2 and 5 years, is the territorial fragmentation of Iran. With Kurdish militias in the west being armed with American and Israeli support, and with Baloch, Azerbaijani, and Arab communities historically marginalized, there is a real risk that Iran will follow the path of post-2003 Libya or Iraq, overthrown regimes that have fragmented into endless civil conflicts. Sociologist Charles Tilly said that war makes the state. In the current Iranian case, the paradox is that external war can either destroy or strengthen the state, depending on how the internal narrative is constructed. If the new regime can frame the conflict as a war of national resistance, similar to 1980s Iraq against Saddam Hussein, it could consolidate popular support even amid economic destruction. On the other hand, if the destruction of civilian infrastructure continues, hospitals, schools, energy facilities, desalination plants, the collapse of basic services could delegitimize the regime in a way that no martyrdom narrative can compensate for. The death of 165 children at a school in Minab was not just a war crime, it was a potential catalyst for internal rupture. One of the most explosive factors in this scenario is the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 20% of all the oil consumed in the world passes through this choke point, just 33 kilometers wide, including supplies to countries such as Japan, South Korea, China, and India. The closure, even partial or temporary, of the strait would have devastating consequences for the global economy. Already in the early days of the 2026 conflict, the Iranian threat to blockade Hormuz generated panic in the oil markets. The countries of the Persian Gulf, which produce 40% of the world's desalinated water and host large American military bases, have found themselves at the epicenter of a war they did not choose. Dubai, one of the world's largest aviation hubs, temporarily closed its airport due to Iranian attacks. If the Iranian regime finally collapses, whether through military pressure, economic crisis, or a new popular revolution, the Middle East will enter a period of reconfiguration unprecedented since the fall of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. The consequences would be multiple and complex. Hezbollah, already weakened, would lose its main sponsor and could finally be disarmed, opening space for the stabilization of Lebanon. The Houthis in Yemen, without Iranian funding, would lose significant operational capacity. Shiite militias in Iraq would enter into an identity and financing crisis. The Sunni Arab world, led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, would see a window for normalization of relations with Israel, modeled after the 2020 Abraham Accords. However, the history of the Middle East is full of warnings about what happens when regimes are overthrown from the outside in. The Iraq of 2003 produced the Islamic State. Libya in 2011 produced a civil war that continues to this day. Syria in 2011 produced one of the largest refugee exoduses in modern history. A fragmented Iran could generate even greater instabilities, not just regional, but global. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi summarized Tehran's position with a phrase that summarizes the dilemma of this entire conflict: Iran will continue to fight for as long as necessary. For a regime that survived the revolution of 1979, the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, decades-long sanctions, the assassination of Soleimani in 2020 and the 12-day war of 2025, this is not just rhetoric. It is a culture of institutional resistance that no aerial strike, no matter how precise, can eliminate alone. What we are analyzing throughout this video is not simply a war between Israel and Iran. It is the result of a decades-long historical process, one that has seen a revolution in 1979, proxy wars in the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of parallel power networks like Hezbollah and Hamas, the failure of nuclear negotiations in the 2000s and 2010s, and the accelerated rupture after October 7, 2023. Each decision that led to Khamenei's death on February 28, 2026 can be traced, step by step, through a chain of events that spans more than 4 decades. Geopolitics rarely produces true surprises, rather, it produces moments when long, silent processes suddenly become visible to the general public. There are questions that the best analysts in the world, from Brookings, Chatham House, Foreign Policy, still cannot answer with confidence. Will the Iranian regime collapse, or will it consolidate around the narrative of martyrdom? Will Khamenei's death be remembered as the end of an era of hostility, or as the beginning of an endless war? Is there a future in which post-Ayatollah Iran becomes a constructive actor in the international system, as Japan and Germany did after World War II? Or will Iran fragment into multiple internal conflicts, like Libya and Iraq? And what will be the human cost of this process, in a country of 85 million people, with one of the oldest civilizations in the world. There is a principle that historians call strategic uncertainty. No actor in a conflict has full access to the consequences of their decisions. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, no one predicted the rise of the Islamic State. When NATO intervened in Libya in 2011, no one calculated that the country would still be in civil war more than a decade later. When the Arab Revolution began in 2010, no one imagined that it would produce democracies, dictatorships, and failed states at the same time. The same principle applies to the current conflict with Iran. American and Israeli strategists have detailed plans for the coming months. But history teaches us, again and again, that plans do not survive contact with reality. And so we come to the question you may be asking yourself right now: what will happen? The honest answer from any serious analyst is, we don't know. What we do know is that we are at a moment of historical bifurcation, a point where the Middle East could go in radically different directions depending on decisions that are made in the coming weeks and months. We may be seeing the beginning of the end of the Ayatollah's rule, and the slow, painful construction of a different Iran. Or we could be witnessing the start of a war of attrition that will consume lives, resources, and regional stability for years to come. Or even, and this is the possibility that worries analysts most, we could be witnessing the beginning of an escalation that none of the actors can completely control. What is certain is that geopolitics is not made up of isolated events. It is made of processes. And the process we are experiencing now will define the Middle East, and in many ways, the world, for decades. If you want to continue understanding these processes, if you want analyses that go beyond the headlines and delve into the root causes of global conflicts, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and share this video with someone who also wants to truly understand the world.